I appreciate the chance to speak in this debate, and I also want to indicate that our party will, of course, be supporting this motion. We'd like to see it strengthened. We'd like to make sure that, in fact, the motion refers not simply to next elections. We think 6 months is too long, and we also think it's got to apply to the election that we've just come out of. And so I will hope there can be some discussions among the parties to make sure that the motion is, in fact, strengthened. Mr. Speaker, just to put this issue in a bit of historical context, I was reading the wonderful book by Alan Taylor called The Civil War of 1812, which is, of course, we're all reading about the War of 1812 because it's our 200th anniversary. And in the course of that book, there's a wonderful description of how Simcoe recruited his Surveyor General David W. Smith to stand for an assembly seat in Essex County in 1792. And the book goes on to say that Smith entrusted electioneering to his wealthy friends, who campaigned in the traditional style by lavishing music, food, and alcohol rather than policy discussions upon the voters. A paternalist rather than an egalitarian, Smith advised his campaign manager, "Let the peasants have a fiddle, some beverage, and beef." Anticipating victory, he planned a culminating celebration, and I quote, "I beg that an ox be roasted, whole on the common, and a barrel of rum be given to the mob to wash down the beef." As Simcoe expected, the book goes on to say, Smith won his seat. Well, that's how politics was conducted in 1792 by the ancestors of the Tory party, which is now in place. But I'd like to simply bring that up to date, Mr. Speaker, by drawing attention to a comment that was made to me by a well-known conservative who I will not name. And he said to me, quote, "Give me a computer and give me an internet access, and I can boom your house and cell phone from 3 continents away at the same time with the same or different message." So it's the same party, it's just a different technology. As opposed to ox and booze, nylons and rum, we have a new way of reaching people. Give me a computer and an internet access, and I can boom your house and boom your cell phone. Mr. Speaker, we have to understand how politics has in fact changed and become such a technology-driven system, but behind every technology there still are the human values as to how we in fact campaign and how we relate to voters and what are the limits. The Canadian way has been a way in which we said we need to have clear laws, we need to have clear accountability, we need to make sure that people are held to account for the things that they say, that there are limits to how much an individual can spend in each riding, and there are limits to how much parties can spend, as we all know. Now, this basic practice in Canada has only been challenged by one party and actually by one person, because it was in another life that the current Prime Minister in fact challenged this system. Yes. And said, we don't want this system, we want the American system. We want a system where anyone can spend whatever money they want. We want a system where there's unlimited access to dough, and that's the kind of system we want for Canada. And in that case, known as Harper versus Canada, I have to mention the name because it's in the title of the lawsuit, Harper v. Canada, the Supreme Court of Canada said no. It's actually reasonable and fair for Canadians to limit the ability of third parties to spend as much money as they want in the course of an election campaign. It's that same Prime Minister who, again in another life, described the people in Elections Canada as jackasses. It's the same Prime Minister who, as Prime Minister, led his party through the so-called in-and-out scandal, and a refusal by this party day after day after day in question period to recognize the problem, to refuse to provide the information, to force Elections Canada to go to court, to get the documents from the government, from the party, and finally, after a 5-year process, cop a plea, accept the fact that they'd done wrong, pay back the money to the government, and pay a fine as well. Mr. Speaker, That has become the culture of the Conservative Party of Canada. And in carrying out that culture, they have, at the same time, and it has to be said very clearly, created a very, very complex but nevertheless effective system of communicating with voters across the country. Now, the Minister of State just gave his ritual response, I think in the course of his speech, in an answer to his questions, and an answer to the questions that were made yesterday by the Parliamentary Secretary, the robo-response king of the House of Commons at the moment. He said that our party and other parties paid millions of dollars to make hundreds of thousands of calls. Of course we did. So did the Conservative Party. That is the common technique which is now used by all political parties. Yep. Some of the calls are made in person by phone banks. Some of them are so-called robocalls. Some of them are teletown halls where people are in fact brought together to listen to a conversation with a political leader or with a candidate. That's one of the techniques that we use. But what has to be clear, Mr. Speaker, is that all of these systems can, of course, be abused, just as there have been abuses in the past. And the question is our Elections Act keeping up with the abuses and the potential abuses? And in fact, are we now able to say that we have a system of regulation and of law, of real accountability to public authorities, which is in fact equal to the technologies which are there? There is nothing wrong with a robocall per se. There is nothing wrong with somebody phoning up and saying, I'm calling on behalf of the Conservative Party, and I'd like to ask you how you intend to vote in the next election. And the voter can say either, go away, I don't want to be annoyed, or they can say, here's the information. There's nothing wrong with either of those things. In fact, when I hear this called the so-called robocall issue, it's not really about robocalls, it's about misleading calls. It's about misinformation in calls. It's not even, Mr. Speaker, about a call which is in fact unpleasant, a call which says that your Liberal candidate or your New Democratic Party candidate has done this, this, and this, and this. There are all kinds of negative things that are said during a campaign. We've all been in all candidates' debates. Every member in the House has been in an all candidates debate. When somebody on the other side said something, we object to. We don't think it's true. We've all seen leaflets which say negative things about our party, or about our candidates, or about our leaders. There's a difference between hardball, tough politics, even negative politics, and dishonest politics. And we have to understand where the line is to be drawn. There's tough things that are said. There's things that are said that we might think are unfair. I happen to think that many of the things that are said, that were said about our former leaders, were very unfair. I think they help to suppress votes and discourage voters. They create a climate in which negativity is there, but I wouldn't say they were illegal. J'ai des objections de temps en temps aux choses qui sont dites qui sont pas justes à mon avis. La publicité envers nos chefs, à mon avis, était dure. Et je suis certain que mes collègues dans le Parti conservateur et dans le Parti néo-démocrate, ils vont dire qu'ils ont vu de la publicité qu'ils ont pensé injuste. Mais le problème, c'est qu'il y a une différence entre une politique dure et une politique malhonnête, une politique qui est même négative et une politique qui se base sur la fraude. Et ça, c'est la question qui est devant Elections Canada à présent. Le ministre, je suis certain que le discours qu'a donné le ministre sera répété par tous les députés conservateurs qui parlent aujourd'hui. Répété encore. Laissez-moi dire que, tout simplement, c'est maintenant le Parti conservateur qui est sujet d'une enquête, qui est le sujet d'un ordre très clair de la part de la Cour de devoir produire les documents. Ils n'ont pas de choix. Ils doivent offrir les documents. Nous avons dit que nous sommes prêts à offrir toute coopération avec Elections Canada et leur donner toute l'information que nous avons. Sans problème, sans question. Ça, c'est, je peux dire tout clairement, ça sera fait clairement de la part du Parti libéral du Canada. Mais il faut voir exactement la nature des problèmes que nous avons. Nous avons des exemples, des appels qu'on ne peut pas expliquer. Et il faut trouver des explications. Il y a des exemples où, d'un système qui est très centralisé, c'est le système conservateur, un système très centralisé dans toute sa philosophie et dans toute son organisation. Et nous devons considérer comment est-ce qu'on peut expliquer les choses? Comment expliquer les appels à les familles juives pendant la Pâque, où les familles ont reçu des messages disant qu'ils viennent du Parti libéral du Canada? Et ce n'est pas des robocalls, ce n'était pas des robots appels, c'était des appels des gens en personne, disant qu'ils sont là de la part du Parti libéral, quand nous savons, l'exemple que je peux vous donner, l'exemple dans le bureau de M. le comté de Mont-Royal, le bureau de mon collègue de Mont-Royal, le bureau de campagne était fermé. Ils n'ont pas fait des appels. Alors, on doit trouver une explication. Et si on a beaucoup d'autres comtés où on a la même chose, on peut dire que c'est difficile de dire que c'est une coïncidence. If it happens in one riding, you say, well, this is clearly a rogue situation. But it happens in a riding where you say, well, how do you get access to the central system, which is supposedly you have to have a password? How does the company involved get access to the central system? How do you get access through the company? These are questions which are perfectly legitimate. And one has to say, and one of the first examples that I heard about was actually not involving the Liberal Party at all, but involving the Bloc Québécois in the riding of Rivière-du-Loup in the by-election of 2009, where we heard of an example where a call was made indicating it's a call from the Bloc. It wasn't a call from the Bloc. It was a call coming from somewhere else. How do we explain these phantom calls? How do we explain the number of phantom calls? And then there's a difference, Mr. Speaker, between a call which is dishonest and a call which is intended to suppress a vote, and then a call which is actually intended to misdirect someone, to tell someone a polling station is in place Y when in fact it's in place Z, somewhere else. How do we explain that? How do we explain the number of times that it's happened? Give me a computer and internet access and I can boom your house and cell phone from 3 continents away at the same time with the same or a different message. How do we track down this information? What if some of these calls were coming offshore? What if in fact they're offshore and off book in terms of how they're financed? These are legitimate questions. Because when something happens once, you say it's an accident. When it happens twice, you say, well, let's look into it. When it happens dozens of times in dozens of ridings, there has to be some other explanation. Yep. There has to be some way of getting to the bottom of what it is. Exactly. And that's why I do think the government, if they're sincere in saying, let's get to the bottom of it, the party that can get to the bottom of it the easiest is the Conservative Party of Canada. The campaign team, the people working in the war room, the people who were working in the war room, which was specifically intended to deal with close ridings. I want to say to my Conservative friends, no one involved in this business of politics today can have anything but a grudging sense of admiration for the discipline and organization which goes into the Conservative campaigns. They have a central message. It is repeated over and over and over again. They have raised a lot of money, and that money is put into creating the greatest and latest technology that's available. The problem is, Mr. Speaker, and this is where we have to get to the bottom of it, what are the values of the people who are behind that technology and behind that impressive organization? That's the issue. And that's the issue that Elections Canada can get at from a certain perspective, but it's an issue which only the members of the Conservative Party can deal with themselves. Have they created a culture, Mr. Speaker, in which winning is everything? Have they created a culture in which they say, oh, you guys are just sore losers? Well, I would say, looking over the other side, they're just a bunch of sore winners. I mean, they don't let up. They are relentless in their determination to go forward the way they've gone forward. The way they went forward in 2006 with the in and out, with the brazenness with which they defied any questioning with respect to this subject, the brazenness with respect to they resisted Elections Canada and finally had to succumb to a subpoena.
Police raid.
Yeah, and a police raid in terms of seizing documents. Ça, c'est la question, Monsieur le Président. Quelles sont les vraies valeurs derrière la machine? Oui, comme professionnels dans la politique, nous voyons une machine et nous devons dire que c'est une machine très professionnelle. C'est une machine qui est bien contrôlée du centre. Mais le fait que c'est bien contrôlé du centre, ça veut dire qu'il n'y a pas beaucoup d'accidents, des choses qui arrivent dans les comtés. Et ça, c'est pourquoi nous insistons sur des réponses à nos questions et que, franchement, Monsieur le Président, on ne va pas lâcher. We are not going to let go of this, Mr. Speaker. It is not a pleasant subject because we are constantly having to ask questions about things that we can't quite believe could be happening. And they're not based on, as the words of my colleagues opposite keep saying, they're not based on unsubstantiated smears. They're based on complaints coming from Canadian citizens. Exactly. They're based on complaints coming, and the member opposite shouts out just now, too late. Well, I have news. I have news for that member. I have news for that member. It is never too late for justice and truth to come out. It is never too late. It is never too late. It is never too late for people to bring forward complaints. It is very important for people to recognize that someone who gets a call early in the campaign and is asked, who are you going to vote for, and either declines to answer or says none of your business because the call is coming from the Conservative Party, and then 2 days before the election receives another call saying, oh, your polling station is in Kalamazoo. What do you expect people to draw a conclusion from? And when they hear and they read about other people getting these calls, they say, I got that call too. That's why we have an absolutely unprecedented number of complaints coming into Elections Canada. And one thing the Conservative Party is going to have to come to grips with, it is not a matter of what the Liberal Party thinks or does, or what the NDP thinks or does in this matter, or what the Bloc or the Green Party thinks or does. It's about the Canadian people and what they think. It's about the forms that they're signing. It's about the things that they're saying. The argument of the Conservative Party is not with the Liberal Party and it's not with the NDP. It's with the Canadian people.
Shame.
And they have to understand that. And as they reposition themselves for the umpteenth time, and as their talking points shift the blame from one party to another party to somewhere else, they have to look into their own hearts and minds and ask themselves a simple question. Have we not done something here which we should not have done?
Right.
Now, Mr. Speaker, I make no bones about it. This is an unprecedented situation, to quote from Mr. Kingsley. We are literally in uncharted waters. Those so-called experts or others who say, oh, there's nothing to all of this stuff, I don't think they really understand the implications of what happens when bad values and good technology get all mixed up in the same lethal cocktail. This is what happens. This is what happens, Mr. Speaker. And this is why Elections Canada needs to have these additional powers. I'm glad the Conservatives have backed away from their previous position and done a 180 on this issue. It's time that they did. But we need to make sure that it applies not to future elections, but to this election. Exactly. We need to make sure that it applies to what's happened in these campaigns. And so I look forward to those discussions. Mr. Speaker, we've gone from the serving of beef and the serving of beer, from nylons and rum, to where we are today. And it's something that we have to come to grips with as Canadians. Corruption is corruption is corruption. It shouldn't happen wherever it happens. And we have to deal with it today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.